And as we said last time, he's talking about the early slavery in the New World, basically, and to see how slavery affects everything to this day. And you'll see the roots of the attitudes and the roots of the thinking about slavery and where they came from. And it's quite shocking that we haven't changed all that much since the Constitution and since the Civil War. Not much has changed. But anyway, so I'll leave you to read the news about that tomorrow. But for now, I'll turn it over to Peter, and let's take up and get to the Declaration of Independence.
Well, thanks, Ken, very much. It's great to see all of you. I'm glad you're back. And I'll start where Ken left off with the current news. I was very struck just in this past week to see the comments that were made by Jacob Blake's father after that awful shooting in Kenosha. I was surprised when I heard an interviewer ask him, what does all this mean to still be happening in the 21st century? And his answer surprised me, but it relates to our agenda. He said, it means that chattel slavery was a powerful thing. That's not the comment I expected, but it certainly fits with what I've been trying to argue, that we don't really understand how powerful, how long it lasted. And I talked last time in part one about mostly from the European perspective, about the way in which the Europeans developed deep sea sailing and reached Africa and the New World and began to create an Atlantic world which they dominated. And today in part two, I want to talk more about the 18th century and the consolidating of racism in order to rationalize this crazy system that they had, and profitable system that they had created. And I threw these two pictures on here just to remind you that it wasn't destined necessarily to be the Europeans who first did this. The Chinese around 1400 and the Japanese around 1600 had opportunities to build navies. The Chinese actually got to West Africa, brought back a giraffe, as you can see on the left. But neither the Chinese nor the Japanese were followed through. They turned inward and the field was left to the Europeans. And so I talked last time about the beginnings of the slave trade, the contact with both with Africa and the Americas. And we ended up in 1715 with the British being given the right to sell slaves to the Spanish Empire. And it's in this period in the 18th century that this smaller system expands into a massive operation. The slide shows the entire slave trade over 350 years. And we now think that some 12.5 million people were deported from different parts of West Africa to different parts of the Americas. Most strikingly to the Caribbean, more than 4 million people, and to Brazil, another 4 million people. And surprisingly to most Americans, it's only about 4% of this entire mess that ends up in North America. And you can see the very narrow arrows that point towards the British colonies on the mainland. And you can notice that even those lines are not equal. Very few people being sent to New England, more to the Chesapeake, and nearly twice as many to South Carolina. And so that's going to be a focus for me. So by the 18th century, as you've heard the cliche about the triangular trade, so ships starting in Liverpool or Bristol or Seville ending up on the African coast and then heading west and then back to Europe, or later starting from North America and making a very different kind of triangle. By the 18th century, it's hundreds of ships going to hundreds of ports with a huge interrelated system, but it's still vaguely triangular for most voyages. So the shipment from Africa to the Americas with slaves in the hold is referred to as the middle passage of the three legs of the triangle. And I want to just talk for a second about the middle passage. You can see from things I've said that we know more and more about it quantitatively, but we're also learning more qualitatively, and the more you learn, the worse it gets. It's absolutely shocking. From the moment of being loaded on board ship, and for the adults, the men and often the women had shackles applied both to their ankles and to their hands. They were immediately forced below deck, and often the ship would lay at anchor for 2 or 3 months until it accumulated a full cargo in the hold. Slaves, but also other goods such as ivory, gold, other things. But the huge difference, and this seems obvious, but I want you to think about it, is that we have no visual evidence. We've all talked a lot in the last year or two about how important it is to see murders on videotape, to be aware of shootings. I remember as a child seeing video of the civil rights movement in the South and of police dogs being used. And it was the visualization that made a huge difference. Unfortunately, most of what we have for the slave trade are recreations. What you see on the left is a replica of the hold of a ship that was made by the African American Museum in Detroit. And there were people close to the floor, and then there was a shelf with more people crammed in above them. And it doesn't take much to recall the awful photographs from Buchenwald and other prison extermination camps during World War II, the same kind of situation. There's lots of contrast to be drawn too. But this famous picture with Elie Wiesel on the right comes into my mind when I think about these things. It's not until the end of the century, the late 18th century, that a serious abolition movement begins in England, and the public begins to show some concern and even outrage about what's going on. As I say, they have no pictures. It's all had taken place thousands of miles away. And so this image, which you may have seen, becomes sort of a classic. It's reformers arguing not that the slave trade should be abolished, but that it's inhumane to pack people so tightly, and that legislation should be offered to give each prisoner more square footage. They eventually lean in that direction, but it's not well enforced. But this is the classic image, but it's obviously reality was much more chaotic. Sometimes on smaller ships, men, women, children were all thrown into the same hold. More often on bigger ships, they were divided into separate locations. And one of the only, of course, we have no photograph, but one of the only firsthand sketches we have is this one that was made by a British naval officer after the slave trade had been banned. So the British Navy was stopping ships and catching them if they were shipping Africans illegally to the New World, and he made this sketch, which we still have, and it gives you a sense of the chaos. It does not give you a sense of the smell or the high temperatures or the utterly grim conditions for a voyage that could last anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. People were allowed up on deck for food and for forced exercise. One of the obvious differences with Buchenwald is that the idea is to keep these people alive so they can be sold, so that awnings were often stretched over the deck to keep the heat down somewhat. But conditions were grim, and in rough weather, you could stay below decks for a week at a time.
Were conditions much better for like crewmen?
No, that's a good question. And in fact, the mortality rate is extremely high for both. In fact, often it was higher for the crew, because when they went to the tropics, they were going into a different disease zone, so to speak. They were being exposed to diseases they wouldn't have hit in the North Atlantic. And they often died at the same rate of 10 to 20%, or sometimes even more. They could also die in the course of resistance. There were numerous occasions of obviously tensions were high, but the odds were terrible. If you're shackled, if you have no weapons, one of the things we often forget is that these were people from different parts of the coast of Africa. They often spoke different languages, did not know each other or trust each other. Some might even have been enemies in a prior world. So the possibilities of creating unity and success aboard a ship that you don't know how to sail was almost nil. One of the few successful revolts that we know about is the Amistad. There was a movie made about it a few years ago by Steven Spielberg, but most often it failed. And we were just talking about the high mortality. People who died were thrown overboard. Our modern expression, to be thrown to the sharks, literally comes from the slave trade, because dead prisoners were thrown overboard. Sometimes, even if they were not dead, if they were sick and infected, either expected to die or feared that they might spread some disease, they were thrown overboard while still alive. And sharks followed the ships and also congregated in the New World harbors like Havana and Charleston around the ships, because at the end of the voyage there were people dying from extreme deprivations. So go ahead.
If I could ask a question, were any of these enslaved people also forced to work as part of the crew or anything like that, or was it mostly just sitting in the?
Sometimes they were obliged to turn the capstan, which is a big heavy thing at the bow of a ship, which helps to bring the anchor up. And they could be used, I suppose, to haul on ropes, but they were not in a position to be cooperative usually. Sometimes the younger people were used that way, but these were people many of whom had grown up on rivers and had spent time in dugout canoes and fishing off the coast of Africa, but they'd never been on a sailing ship. So the very notion of what made it go forward and how anybody knew where they were going was a complete mystery. to them. So no, they were not. They often had to pound their own rice, which would then be cooked to eat. So they had some engagement in feeding themselves, but not much beyond that. But so the point I want to stress is that as this system expands and becomes more regularized and shockingly efficient, it creates a dilemma for the Europeans. And we talked last week about the terrible transformation, this idea that you're no longer being enslaved because you're a non-Christian. That doesn't work because you can easily convert to being a Christian. So by the 1680s, there's more emphasis on color, or what we would call race. And Europeans then have to somehow rationalize what it is they're doing. Most of them are going to church on Sunday. And this is a horrendous undertaking. As you probably know, the hymn Amazing Grace was written by a former slave captain who repented for what he had been doing. But you either had to repent and write hymns about it, or you had to basically cover it up. What I say here is to rationalize it either by denial or by blaming the victim. So the first failures really come from the government and the churches, which cave in to the forces of capitalism, if you call it that. I mean, it's an immensely profitable operation for the people involved. Education and science, as it is developing, also contribute more than they resist to the operation. And the result of all that is that in the 18th century, you begin to get this immense negative stereotype of Africans. You remember last week I showed you one of the three kings as an African, and he was very handsome and thoughtful and pious, and the stereotypes that evolve now to rationalize the slave trade and the exploitation in the New World tend to be extremely negative. And remember that people have no clue of genetics. Mendel and Darwin are still far away. And so these stereotypes, and I note here that they were contradictory, because really powerful stereotypes often get you from both sides. If you think about discrimination against women on the basis of gender, often the negative stereotypes over the years have been, either you're too passive or you're too domineering, and you can't, those become so big that you can't win in between. So the stereotypes about Africans, that they are dangerous on the one hand and lazy on the other, or they're stupid on the one hand and devious on the other, or they're ugly on the one hand and sensuous on the other, or they're happy and contented on the one hand, or violent and dangerous on the other hand. And that morphs in the 18th century into a whole system. It gets refined over time. In the 19th century, so-called scientific racism weighs in, with people measuring skulls and creating all sorts of pseudoscience that reinforces the negative stereotypes. But my point is that this deep-seated racism is fully embedded before the American Revolution, just the way that the plantation system itself has already become ensconced. So in the 18th century, the other thing that happens is that these people, that 4% being brought to North America, as I pointed out on the map, are not distributed evenly. And you can see it pretty dramatically on this little graph. So for any African, where you end up can make a significant difference. And you can see here that the numbers arriving in New England, the green columns, never amount to anything in comparative terms. In the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, slightly larger numbers, but hugely larger numbers after 1700 in the southern colonies. And that differentiation is important, culturally, politically, every other way. If you happen to be an African who is taken to Massachusetts the way Amos Fortune was, you may end up in a graveyard in Putney, Vermont, with a very typically New England Puritan grave marker for yourself and your wife. He was born free in Africa, a slave in America. He purchased liberty, professed Christianity, lived reputably, and died hopefully. He started out as an enslaved, a slave for a leather tanner. He learned the trade of leather tanning. He bought his own freedom. He bought his wife's freedom. He moved to Putney and is buried there. So it's a sign of, it's an emblem of massive assimilation when numbers are small, and when you're surrounded by a much larger English-speaking population. It was very different if you arrived in, say, the Chesapeake Bay, which is where Alex Haley's furthest back American ancestor, Kunta Kinte, arrived in Annapolis, Maryland on the slave ship Lord Ligonier in 1767, and immediately found himself on a tobacco farm where enslaved workers were planting, hoeing, picking the tobacco, then drying the leaves, and then pressing them into huge hogsheads and rolling them down to ships that docked along the Chesapeake's many rivers. You can see on the right in this little cartouche from a map that was made in 1751 that the planters are well ensconced. They have a servant boy providing them with wine while they exchange their money, while workers load these huge hogsheads of tobacco. First they weigh them and then they load them on board ships. You see the map there, incidentally, is made by Peter Jefferson. That's Thomas Jefferson's father. So even when, as a young man, Thomas Jefferson is growing up in a world where both the plantation system, what I would call slave labor camps, and the racism needed to rationalize it, and Jefferson picks up some of this, that these people are not quite all there, that he's surprised if any of them show any ingenuity or wit or strength. And that's already there by the middle of the 18th century. So just to illustrate this variation, and then we can pause for a second. But by the middle of the 18th century, if you look counterclockwise from Massachusetts, moving south, here you have a big old colony with only 2% Africans, and maybe half of those are enslaved. New York has a bigger population because the Dutch had brought enslaved people into New Amsterdam, but it's still a small slice of the overall pie. Virginia, a much larger colony because it's founded very early and grows very fast, has the biggest African-American population by the mid-18th century, but it still doesn't have a majority. And it's the proportions as much as the total numbers that determine the way different colonies develop. And it's South Carolina that by early in the 18th century has a Black majority. It's at least 60% by the middle of the century, and it will continue that way. And I want it partly because it's one of my keen interests, but mostly because I think it's central to our understanding of the broader system. I want to zero in the second part of my chat on South Carolina. But before I do that, let me break for a second, see if there are any questions so far.
Peter, it's Leslie. There's some questions in chat for you.
Okay, I can maybe pick one, Ken, and feed it to me, and then we'll move on. We can hit the others later.
You're muted, Ken.
Thank you. So I'll start with the students' questions first. So was it only North that freedom could be purchased? You alluded to people purchasing their freedom, the leather tanner and so forth.
Right. I mean, it could and did happen in the South as the system becomes bigger and more complicated and more regularized. There are certain loopholes. And so you can be purchased, but it's harder to earn money on your own. I mean, if you're out in the tobacco fields all day, you're not going to earn money on your own. Some people had Sundays off where they worked in their own gardens, and sometimes they could sell produce from their own garden, and maybe, but it even became illegal in the 18th century to even possess money. If you were Black and possessed money, it was assumed that you'd stolen it somehow, because how could you have gotten it any other way? So you were constantly and the other thing is that there were no plantations in the North. You know, if you were working for someone else, you were working in their carpentry shop or with a silversmith, or you were learning a trade. It was very different from being one of hundreds of people stuck in a huge slave labor camp for life, where you could never leave. You had to have a written pass to leave, and you couldn't read the written pass to begin with. You were much more likely in the North to become literate, and that became a huge asset. So let me forge ahead, and then we'll do some more questions after that.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to zero in now on South Carolina, and not all of South Carolina, just the Low Country. Because this is a very distinctive region stretching from the edge of North Carolina to the edge of Florida, reaching back about 50 miles inland from the coast, a coast that is lined with small islands that are barely separated from the mainland. But there were no bridges in the 17th or 18th century. There are many now. So they were called the Sea Islands. So you often hear it referred to as Sea Island country, or the Low Country, or Gullah culture. There's now, or in Georgia, sometimes they called it Geechee culture, but it was a society that was heavily Africanized, as we'll see, unlike any other part of North America. And in the 19th century, it was thousands of people living in small slave cabins like this. But now in the 21st century, It's big second houses built by rich white people who create golf courses around them. So the demographic makeup of the region is changing drastically, though there still is a cultural heritage that is being preserved as best as possible. But even when I went there 50 years ago for the first time, it was very different from what it is now. So that's the region I want to talk about. And you can see that Charleston is at the very center of it. Georgetown, which I'm going to mention in a minute, is up here on the to the northeast, and to the southwest is Savannah, and further down would be St. Augustine. So this concentration that I showed you in the pie chart means that people from different parts of Africa share what things they have in common from their prior experience, and they're cut off to a great extent from other cultures. They're having some interaction with Europeans, some, especially in the early period, with Native Americans who are also being enslaved. So there's some exchange going on, but the language, the religion, the food, the dress, music, all these things that I've listed and many more stay remarkably similar to West Africa over centuries, well into the 20th century. And if we zero in, so here you have South Carolina, just to get oriented, and here you have the Low Country, and these are all tidal rivers in red, and then Charleston would be right there. And if you look at a close-up of Charleston, you can see where Fort Sumter is, where the Civil War began. But just across the harbor is Sullivan's Island. Here's a close-up map of Sullivan's Island, and you can see Pest House written there. The Pest House, this was a quarantine station for incoming slave ships. And they would often unload their prisoners onto Sullivan's Island for several weeks to make sure that any disease had subsided, that wounds had healed up. If you sit on a deck for more than a week or two, you certainly get terrible burns on your hips and elbows and knees. Eventually, they're taken across the harbor to Charleston and sold into the slave market and shipped all along the coast to these expanding plantations. And let me bring this home to you. This is an American family you recognize. And if you think about Malia and Sasha Obama, who were born right around 2000, they're not too much different in age from some of you. Their mother's born in 1964, Michelle. And we know their father's ancestry. His father is from Kenya, and that part of the ancestry goes back there. His mother is from Kansas, and that white ancestry would be there. But if you follow Michelle Robinson Obama's genealogy back, her father was Fraser Robinson. His father was Fraser Robinson Jr., who moved to Chicago from the Sea Islands. Fraser Sr. was born during Reconstruction. And then when you get here, before the Civil War, you reach Jim Robinson, who was born a slave on Fairfield Plantation near Georgetown, South Carolina. I pointed that place out to you on the map. Fairfield Plantation, and just think about the scope of this, was 3,300 acres of cleared marshland, 230 enslaved workers, producing 900,000 pounds of rice annually. So it's a huge industrial operation. And what's striking for most, two things are striking about non-Black Americans. If most of your ancestry is European, you probably are linked somehow to vaguely to the Ellis Island world, and your furthest back ancestor probably arrived after 1900 on average. And similarly with Asian Americans, it would be a very late migration. The majority of African Americans have a furthest back person before the American Revolution. So Alex Haley's ancestor, Kunta Kinte, in 1767 would be typical in an African American family. But if you follow the back here, we don't know the names the way we do here, but we do know where they were. They were in Georgetown and what they were doing. They were in Georgetown County, South Carolina, growing rice, because there was very little mobility, unlike most Americans who have high mobility in their families and have moved around the country. Many of you have just popped in here to live in Boulder, just the way I have. I mean, we're often highly mobile, but in a slave system, now some of these people are going to escape. Some of them are going to be sold to Georgia and later to Alabama. So, but most of them are going to stay right within maybe a 20-mile region for 12 generations. So that's something striking to think about. And what they were doing was this. They were growing rice. It was a hugely productive crop, and the knowledge for it was brought from Africa. So here you see an aerial photograph that a friend of mine took of, you can fly up and down the coast and see this and take hundreds of pictures like this. And you see these winding tidal rivers, that's why they call it the Low Country, with these immense marshes that were turned into vast rice fields. So all of those straight lines are dug by hand by Africans and African Americans over generations. And to me, it's like the Great Pyramids of Egypt, because you can see these canals literally from outer space. They're created over generations by enslaved workers, just the way we think the pyramids were. And these are fields that haven't been used to grow rice for more than a century, and yet you can still see these canals that were used both to irrigate the rice fields and also the larger trunk canals where they had to load barges with the harvested rice and take it back to the plantation where it would be processed. And again, you can see that this is an African crop, and the tools that were used were very similar in West Africa and in the Low Country, even in the early 20th century, where we have photographs to compare. Sewing baskets was an important women's trade and skill in West Africa and in the Low Country. The beautiful fanner basket that I hope maybe you can see over my shoulder was used to winnow the rice after it had been pounded in that mortar and pestle. And it was done in a very similar way, both in West Africa and in the Low Country. And even the rice fields themselves were dug with an implement called a cayendo that was West African in origin. This is actually, the picture on the right is one that was found by a CU history grad student a couple of years ago, and she's now graduated and is writing an article about these African mud shovels that were used to dig the canals and to clean out the canals. It was a constant and difficult process. So that's the work that people were doing. It was immensely profitable to their white owners. And when I started working in South Carolina in the pre-computer 70s, I wanted to look at a sample of incoming slave ships. So I was able, by hand, the old-fashioned way, to track down every slave ship in I just wanted a 5-year period. And you can see there the totals of what I found was that more than 66 ships in 5 years. The largest one had almost 400 people. The average brought about 175 people. That means that another 25 at least had died in the passage. Most of them were young adults, more 85%, but small children made up a whole portion. So this was a steady influx. Those numbers may not look large, but Charleston itself as a city had fewer people than 11,000. So this is a very large influx. And the reason that I picked those 5 years was because I had come across something that almost no one had ever heard of, which was the Stono Revolt, which began in September 1739, just south of Charleston. You can see on the map, it was still called Charlestown in those days. Georgetown is up here. The Stono River is just about 15 miles south of Charleston. That's where it began. St. Augustine, still controlled by the Spanish, is in northern Florida. And the rivalries that I described last week between the English and the Spanish are still very keen. So the Spanish send word into Charleston through the grapevine that if you can escape from the wicked Protestant English in Carolina, you can come to St. Augustine and we'll make you free. And people start escaping by boat in small groups. And then in September of 39, there's a major uprising that's organized by a small group. They attack a warehouse at Stono Landing, kill the 2 owners, cut off their heads, leave them on the steps, take the guns that are in the store, and start marching south on a road that looks very much like this. I took a group of Boulder County high school students there last year, and it still looks like this. And their plan was to march south and to burn plantation houses and kill planters along the way, sparing certain planters whom they had respect for or who treated their slaves liberally, but they kill 20 or 30 people and recruit dozens and dozens of volunteers who march with them. But they're finally stopped before they are able to get to the Savannah River. Many are killed. There's a showdown, a fight. Indians are brought in to help the colonists fight these people. Some survive, and it takes years to find them, but many are killed. Their heads are cut off and put on posts on the road into Charleston, so that other slaves will know never to undertake this kind of operation. And the repercussions are swift. South Carolina enacts a much harsher new slave code in 1740 that remains in effect until the Civil War. And they also impose a tax on new incoming slaves in hopes that they can reduce the percentage of the huge black majority. Part of the slave code says that for every 6 Africans, there has to be at least 1 white person on the plantation, so on and so forth. But that holds for 3 or 4 years, but by 1750, they're back. The slave trade is up and running again, full tilt. And one of the richest people in Charleston is this man whom you may or may not have heard of, Henry Lawrence, a huge slave trader and rice planter, who has an English associate. In Austin and Lawrence are in the trade together. And he will go on to become the president of the Second Continental Congress, succeeding John Hancock. So in that 25 years leading up to, say, 1775, the slave trade is booming. South Carolina is being dominated by people like Lawrence. And so when the revolution comes, South Carolina as a colony is very reluctant to join. They're a white minority. They need the presence of the British Navy to protect their slave trade, to aid them if there are revolts. They have a strong commerce with the West Indies, and the West Indian sugar planters are loyal to the crown. They don't join in the revolution. And so, as you know, the founding fathers and the leaders of the revolution are made up, those coming from the South are largely people like Lawrence, Jefferson and Washington, and Mason and others in Virginia. But Lawrence is a very powerful figure, and he's torn which way to turn. Many of his compatriots become loyalists and flee to England or to the West Indies. He throws in his lot with the colonists, but has no notion that slavery should end, or that liberty and freedom should extend to African Americans. Interestingly enough, his son, who is educated in England, is part of the revolutionary generation. He works as an aide for George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And he's been infected by the abolitionist spirit that's beginning to grow in England while he's there. He urges his father to push for liberating slaves. His father drops out of the slave trade, but never fully turns the corner. The slave trade itself pauses for almost a decade during the long American Revolution. There's very little shipping going back and forth, but it is reinstituted after the Revolutionary War. You may remember that in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson blames King George and says, you know, we didn't really want slaves, he just forced them upon us. But the fact is that after the colonies become an independent nation, these southern colonies go back heavily into the slave trade. So for enslaved people who are listening to this rhetoric of liberty and freedom, the American Revolution becomes a lost opportunity. Many of them join in the war, many of them on both sides, uncertain which side might give them their freedom, but hopeful that if they fight and participate, they may gain a benefit from it. The ones who choose the loyalists end up going to Canada. Some of them even go back to Africa. But thousands of Black Southern enslaved and free people join in the war. When Lafayette comes back in the early 19th century to visit, make a triumphal tour Many of the former black soldiers who knew him at the time come up, talk to him, tell him how much they wish they had been freed during the revolution. They're not, and they have to wait another 3 generations for the liberation of these huge slave labor camps all across the South. So in the final year, so you may remember that the Constitution in 1787, the Article 1 deals with the legislature, and Section 9 is all the things that are not in the power of the legislative branch, and it states explicitly in the Constitution that there cannot be any controlling of the slave trade for at least 20 years. That would be 1808. But it becomes clear by 1803, 1804 that Congress is going to limit prohibit the Atlantic slave trade. And you immediately see the numbers start to ramp up in South Carolina. So much so that in 1805, the Charleston Gazette, and this is grim but telling, there's a notice in the Charleston Gazette that warns citizens not to eat fish from the Cooper River, since so many African corpses have been pushed off the city docks to rot in the harbor. So there's a glut, if you will, of enslaved people being forced in, and it's 3 times bigger in 1807 than it is in 1804, because there's a sense that if this trade is going to end, we need to get as many people in here before the limit, which Congress sets at the earliest possible date, January 1st, 1808. So all through that year of 1807, the Charleston merchants are sending extra ships to Africa, bringing as many enslaved people as they can, nearly 16,000 imported in that 1 year. And then a brutal thing happens on top of that, which is that the traders decide to hold back on selling these people, knowing that their prices will go up after the trade ends. So that by January 1st, 1808, there are thousands of enslaved people stuck on the docks in Charleston, and we have a firsthand account by a visiting Englishman in the spring of 1808. He says, close confinement, scanty clothing, sharp weather, and improper food created a variety of disorders, which along with dysentery and contagious diseases considerably increased the mortality. Upwards of 700 died in less than 3 months. Carpenters were daily employed in making shells, caskets for their dead bodies. A very grim picture. And this is almost exactly 100 years from where we started this evening. I don't want to go beyond that, but I do want to show you just a few slides to give you a sense of where this is headed. If you think of slavery as a cancer, you can see how it, and think of these maps as x-rays, you can see how the disease changes over time and how it concentrates in the South. So at the time of the new nation, there's still 40,000 slaves in the North. Their conditions are different, as we've said. They're not great, but they're only 2% of the Northern population, and their slavery is being phased out very rapidly. So that by 1830, there's fewer than 4,000 enslaved people still living in the North, while the Southern slave population in 40 years has jumped from 650,000 to more than 2 million and has begun to expand, to metastasize, to move west of the Mississippi River. And you can see that it's these yellow, white and yellow dots. The white dots are areas that are 75% enslaved population. The yellow are 95% enslaved population. And you can see in the lower right that the Sea Island region of coastal Carolina and Georgia is more than 95% Black in many areas, with absentee planters and huge plantations. Fairfield, where Michelle Robinson Obama's ancestors were located, is only one of scores. And then if you jump further to 1860, the time of the Civil War, you can see that the slave population has doubled again. It's now 0 in the North. It's nearly 4 million spread across the Deep South. And now it's not only coastal Carolina, but it's also the Mississippi Delta region and the lower Mississippi, which are now growing cotton, and new planter aristocracy is emerging as you move further west. But it's Charleston, I would argue. It's no surprise that Charleston is the spot where the Civil War begins. And sadly, it's really no surprise that it's in Charleston in 2015 that there's this terrible murder of Black parishioners at the AME Church in Charleston, all in the name of white supremacy. So it's this South Carolina piece of the puzzle that we have not understood very well, but that gives us a clearer sense of where the enslavement system and the racist rationalization was most intense. Obviously, up until, maybe it's not obvious, up until 1900, 90% of African Americans were living in the South. It's only in the 20th century that changes. By the 1960s, it's down below 60%, and it has stayed there ever since. That's the Great Migration that Jacob Lawrence made wonderful pictures to document, and which really explains why wherever you grew up in the United States, whether it's in Seattle or San Francisco or Chicago or Boston, the Black communities are now very large because of this Jim Crow exodus. But just to end by going back to South Carolina and coming up to the sad present, I want to acknowledge Chad Boseman, who died this week. Many of you know that he was the hero of the Black Panther series, but he also played Jackie Robinson, one of my heroes. When he came to fame when he made that movie called 42 back in 2013. Jackie Robinson grew up in Cairo, Georgia. Chad himself was born in Anderson, South Carolina. When he played James Brown, James Brown was born in Barnwell, South Carolina. So the image that I've often used is of thinking of Charleston Harbor and Sullivan's Island as with nearly 200,000 enslaved people coming in through that port. It's much the biggest slave port in North America. And I think of it as an hourglass with the grains of sand from all over West Africa being collected, being funneled through Charleston Harbor, and then spreading out first along the coast and then throughout the South, and then in the 20th century throughout all of the United States. So the majority of African Americans today trace some ancestry back to this world of early South Carolina. So let me stop there and see what kind of questions and feedback we get.
So I'll just I'll do the people who ask some questions on chat that
sure
can bring up. So one question was I think was answered, but just you might want to amplify, was a question of why the South was so why the South ended up concentrating all the slave populations. Why didn't they migrate to other areas when they were available?
Yeah, that's a good question. You remember I showed a map last week of English colonization and the Puritans going to New England and the Cavaliers going to Virginia, people who were royalists, they started out differently in terms of the population and their attitudes and their politics, but they also were entering into very different regions. If you've ever spent time in New England, you don't have a long growing season, and you have a very long winter, and you have very rocky soil. If you go to the Carolinas or Georgia, you have a much longer growing season. You remember last time I showed a map of the Gulf Stream where you could see all that warm water, warm air, fertile soil that makes it a semi-tropical climate and makes it possible to grow tropical or semi-tropical crops. So it took hold there. It's also closer to the Caribbean, where the earliest settlers in South Carolina actually come from Barbados, bringing enslaved people with them. So it's already in their heads. And it's a question, I think, of momentum, that once they've seen how profitable it is, once they've made money off of it. I should explain that the first step if I go back to 1700, that when you come into the Low Country, it was marshes, but it was also cypress swamps that had to be cleared. And the way they did it was clever. There was a demand for meat in the Sugar Islands to feed enslaved people in the Caribbean. So they let cattle loose in the marshes. They branded them, but they didn't have to tend them. They didn't build fences. They just let them fatten up and reproduce in the marshes. Then they would round them up in a cow pen, usually using an African as the cow herder. It's where our word cowboys comes from. And they would then slaughter the cattle, put the meat in barrels, ship it to the West Indies, and then once they could make enough money that way, they could buy slaves in the Caribbean and bring them back. And then they could put them to work chopping down the cypress swamps. It took them 30, 40 years, and it was an ever expanding process, but that was the way that they plugged into the system. And all up and down the Americas, from Carolina to Brazil, you could find similar stories like that of colonies that sometimes reluctantly, sometimes eagerly buy into this system. And some of them buy in with a vengeance. So in the West Indies, they buy in so much that they say, we can make so much money off sugar, we're going to work these people to death, literally. Life expectancy was like 5 or 6 years on a sugar island plantation. And then we'll be so rich we can buy more from Africa. And one of the differences in North America was they didn't take that route. Their products weren't quite as profitable. And they said, actually, we're going to not work these people quite so hard. We're going to allow them to have families, raise children. And then that way we will create the next generation of workers. We won't have to work these people to death and buy more. So life expectancy goes up. And from the planter's point of view, you become more valuable if you're going to survive for 25 years instead of 6.
Okay, another question that sort of impinges on our concept of biology, I think, a little bit is, and you also alluded to this a bit, but there's this concept of color versus race, and is it only dark skin? Is it a genetic feeling about, when did that concept that was it all, it just developed over time, or?
I don't know if I can give a good short answer to that, but let me try. I mean, there's this color differentiation, and that's going to be the rule we use because that keeps everybody where we want them to be. Then immediately there are people who are neither black nor white and who are me. And so I talked last time about how they changed the rules so that you inherit your mother's status. So then you have lots of mixed race slaves. But as this stereotype is evolving, it's crass pseudoscience, but for instance, people from West Africa come from a malarious zone. They have sickle cell trait, which often gives them added resistance to malaria. So if that person works in the malaria swamps of South Carolina, they're going to get less sick than the Irishman working next to them. Now, the interpretation of that, self-serving interpretation in the 18th century for the white folks was, oh, see, these people like to work in the hot sun. They have thick skins. That became part of the stereotype. We Europeans are sensitive, and we can't go out in the hot sun, and doesn't seem to bother them a bit. They were also struck that women would go into the fields as well as men, because in Europe, women did less work in the fields, except at harvest time, perhaps. Whereas in West Africa, women were full-fledged farmers very often and had control of the rice crop from beginning to end. And that, from the planter's perspective, then becomes part of the stereotype. Oh, the women are willing to go out in the field. They're so tough, nothing bothers them, et cetera, et cetera. So as the stereotype evolves, it does become, it interacts with the science of the day. So by the 19th century, when phrenology becomes a big deal, there are these racist scientists who believe that they can organize the categories of human life hierarchically with big-brained white people at the top and Aboriginal black people at the bottom, and then all kinds of intermediate categories and races, and they argue about those things.
Yeah, that was a comment that went on through the 1920s, even in the U.S. The whole eugenics movement.
Well, that's my point, is that once the negative stereotype, and which is racism after all, once that gets built and articulated and expanded, it evolves and grows. It doesn't go away. And you may have, I think I skipped over it there at the end, but that last slide that I showed of those X-ray maps, in 1860, you've got nearly 4 million enslaved people. The Civil War ends that within 5 years, bang. Legally, there's no more legal slavery. And so the map on the right for 1870 showed no slavery at all. But it didn't excise racism. The racism was stronger than ever. And there was no real effort to undermine it or penalize it or re-educate it or move away from it. Instead, social Darwinism takes over, and we get a new scientific version of human hierarchies. Obviously, the fact that these people came from Africa, and when Darwin makes certain connections non-human species in Africa, that you can imagine how late 19th century racists and white supremacists jump on that, and they've never let go.
Yeah, that's good. Let's see, a student asks, was curious about why abolition in England seemed to take hold before sort of abolition in the New World. Why was it that?
It's a good question, but I'll give a common sense answer. I mean, they had very little direct stake in it. There were very few Africans in England. There were some. There's a wonderful new book called Black Tudors about blacks in Tudor England under Elizabeth, and they're there, but in very small numbers, and sometimes they're coming with West Indian planters. And there's a famous case in the late 18th century, the Somerset case, where a West Indian planter brings his slave with him back to London because they had the sugar planters had a huge lobby in the Parliament. He brings his slave with him, and Somerset sues for his freedom and says, you know, maybe I was a slave in the West Indies, but here I should be free. And an English judge rules in his favor, the Somerset case of 1772. And it has huge reverberations. In other words, once you come to England, you're free. And word gets out in Virginia that within 6 months, we have records of slaves escaping in Virginia saying, I'm going to get to England because the king has freed all the slaves, and it's okay if I can get over there. So the grapevine is tremendous. And let me pause there for a second. I want to throw this in. I was hoping somebody would ask me about my current research, but because what I'm working on now is beyond all these horrendous things that are probably pretty familiar to most of us. We're very inattentive to the fact that for 200 years, these people that I've described, 4 million by the Civil War, and probably 10 million all told over the generations, were not allowed to read and write. The post-Stono law of 1740 is the first one we can find on the record books that forbids you to teach any of these people to read and write. And if they are caught with a book, they'll be punished. And before that, there wasn't that much literacy going on anyway, but so think about that. I mean, that's a huge difference in a culture that is becoming more and more print oriented. You know, the colonies by the time of the Revolution have more newspapers per person than England does. I mean, they're very print conscious, and those Connecticut Yankees in New England are very education conscious. They're setting up public schools. They believe that you can't have a decent culture without good education, and when the revolution comes, they believe it even more. If we're going to be informed citizens, we have to have schools. We have to, you know. So the idea of being forbidden to read and write, and of course we have wonderful, inspiring stories of people like Frederick Douglass who learned to do it in secret, but the vast majority of everybody I talked about, all those orange and yellow and white dots on the map, none of those people could read and write. Now, did they have a rich oral culture? Yes, they did. And did they have music and folklore and storytelling? But in terms of access to Norland Library, they did not have it.
Ironically, you know, that approach is still ongoing in the inner cities, right? The public school system, you know, the Betsy DeVosses and so forth want to make sure that that's perpetuated, I think.
Yes, and that has deeper roots than she knows.
Yeah. One other thing, this came to mind. I'll usurp anybody else's question for one more question, which was that, you know, even though England did away with actual slavery, racism persisted and persists, right, in England, just like in North America, and your skin color matters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it evolves. So in these European countries that are, I suppose you could call them perpetrators, that they're the initiators of this, and they compete with each other to get slaves from Africa, to seize islands in the Caribbean, to push Indians westward in the Americas. I mean, they're behind the initial impulse, and then their colonists carry it forward. But because they're so far removed, it takes them even longer to face up to it. I mean, but whether you look at Britain or France, or Spain, their understanding of their own complicity in all this, and their intellectual leadership in many ways, is very slow to come. But in the 19th century, as the abolition movement takes hold, it becomes an international movement. So there are, Frederick Douglass spends time in England giving lectures, and English abolitionists spend time in America giving lectures, and they feed off each other and reinforce each other. But they have a different background, different stakes.
Okay, so it's getting a little late, but are there any other questions from anyone in the audience? That just unmute and speak up if you have a question. Anybody? Otherwise, we have one question, Mike.
Yeah, one question. So I noticed on the manifests that there are almost equal numbers of men and women, and even some children. Did the slavers try and capture families? And if so, how the hell did they do that?
No, often, if you raid a house, you're capturing a family. So often families were taken, but it becomes, in a sad way, it becomes like any other market, with sort of supply and demand, and trying to figure out what's going to make you the most money and what's going to cost. Obviously, if you put a 10-year-old kid on the ship, he or she is going to consume less water and food than somebody bigger, but they're going to command a lower price. And so the majority of the people that they look for are between 15 and 30, young adults, women in childbearing years, men in their most muscular years, and more men than women. So all told, the trade takes, I think, more than 60% male. I mean, it's not 50-50. And of course, it would be a whole separate subject to talk about the impact of all this on West African societies. The loss of people and knowledge is huge over time. But in terms of keeping families together, it becomes part of the abolition argument, that, oh dear, you're splitting up so many families, that can't be good, that appeals to people's Christian sympathies somehow. But in actual practice, I don't know if any of you ever see the Smithsonian Magazine, but there's an article in the new issue about a Black woman trying to trace what happened to her great-grandfather in Davenport, Iowa in 1850. He's a 2-year-old boy. He's snatched by a slave catcher and sold down the river and sold into slavery. So he's born free in Iowa, ends up on an Alabama plantation. And that was going on all the time, sort of a reverse Underground Railroad. Just as there were people trying to escape out of this huge gulag of slave labor camps, there were people being sucked into it. The 12 Years a Slave is the most familiar story to many of us, but that happened to hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of people.
Okay, so, oh wait, last question, Julie, and then
Okay.
that's it. Then we have to let people go have
Okay,
dinner.
yeah, I know it's late, but I'm curious what your take is on John Brown as an abolitionist.
Oh boy, that's my next article. It
Oh,
has
really?
it has been my next article for I've done a lot of writing on the 5 Black people who were with him, and I'll try to give you a very short version, but I think he's very misunderstood. I think he's closer to Greta Thunberg.
Mhm.
In other words, and he may be on the spectrum somewhere, but in other words, while everybody else is waffling around and say, oh, what are we going to do? How do blah, blah, blah. He's like, no, don't you see? There's 4 million people enslaved there and we have to get them out. But he's not we're going to get them out by blowing it up. That's not his strategy at all. He's portrayed that way.
Right.
And been misunderstood. He was not against the use of violence, but it was, if you won't let me free your slave, I'm free to shoot you. His freedom means that much to me. But his plan when he raids the arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859 is to seize those guns and move into the mountains. He, unlike most Northern abolitionists, understands the Appalachian mountain chain. He's been there. He spent time in Tyler County, West Virginia. He's staked out that region. And I don't know if any of you've ever been in Southern Appalachia, but believe me, it's not the low country. It's nothing but small mountains and windy roads, and it's perfect for guerrilla warfare. And it stretches all the way to North Georgia. So his strategy is that we're going to take these guns, we're going to move into Southern Appalachia, we're going to set up outposts. As soon as word gets to people in central Georgia that all they have to do is go 100 miles, if they can get to the mountains, we'll get them out of there. And that's his plan. In other words, to kill as few people as possible. If you chase them and I have to shoot you, I'll do it. But I can never win, especially once federal troops get sent in. I mean, we're not going to win a war. We're going to win it by attrition, by getting more and more people to run away. So I call it Underground Railroad 2.0. Instead of a dozen people, we're going to up the ante. We're going to get a steady stream of people moving out. The more it succeeds, the more people will hear about it. The more this happens, the more the slave economy will collapse. He was brilliant, and he's been misunderstood and misportrayed. He's not a pacifist. I'm not saying that, but he thinks there's a way to undo slavery rapidly without killing 700,000 people, which is what happens in the Civil War.
Thank you. I'd love to read your article in the making.
Okay, that's good incentive. Thanks to you guys. I mean, I appreciate your being so attentive and thinking about this. We all need to be thinking about it, and so I hope this is useful. It's been fun for me.
Everybody who's left, unmute so you can give a round of applause.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Have a great semester.
Okay, thanks.
We're trying.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
So here we are. Bye.
Bye, Ken. Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Bye, Tintin.
Bye.